Before you import anything into Premiere, it's important to pre-organize those things before they go into Premiere. Now, there's technical reasons for that, but they're not going to make so much sense without you guys having some experience. So please just remember, pre-organize before you bring things into Premiere. And by that, I mean you have it in a subfolder on your desktop in a place where you know you can find it later, and you don't need to rename that subfolder later. You don't need to move that subfolder later. That's going to be great for pre-organization. Just to have your video files in a folder before they come into Premiere, have music files in a subfolder before they come into Premiere. Yeah, there are some technical reasons for that, but again, they'll make sense if you actually have some more experience with the software. It just saves you time is the quick answer, because sometimes you can lose your files, or Premiere can lose the files if you make changes to those subfolders later on. All right, so opening Premiere from scratch here. See that guy bounce up and down on the dock, lovely little graphic. This daredevil on a motorcycle, that's a pretty cool image, nice silhouette shot, really cool perspective. Nice yellow tone to it. Here, I'm just filling in time while it's opening. Okay, at the opening screen, let's click on New Project. And then there are a couple of key things to check out here in this opening screen here. First, you can actually just give your project a name at the get-go. Project 3A, revealing shots. And then note, but you don't actually have to change. Note what it says for the location. The default should be similar to what you're seeing on my screen here. Users, mquin, the user of this laptop, inside of the movies subfolder, inside of a subfolder called Premiere Project Files. So the project file, it's going to be a specialized file. It's not the movie itself. When you're actually doing editing with software, you don't have a movie until you export the movie. But what you do have is what's called a project file. And it's a project file which is specific to the software. It's a Premiere project file. And it's good for you to know that inside of this pathway of folders, users, mquin, movies, Premiere, project files, inside of the project files subfolder along those breadcrumbs is going to be the project file for this editing project. And it can be useful just to note that in case you want to open up or in case you want to find where that project file is on your computer, it's under this pathway. But the good news is when you open up Premiere later, there's going to be like a little list and a menu at the opening screen of recently accessed project files. And you should be able to see yours there on the opening homepage as a shortcut. And so that's usually how I open my stuff, is because I usually just open more recently saved projects, which are there on the homepage. All right, so this stuff, you can ignore these various things. And then these defaults probably you can ignore, but the display format, the default should be timecode. Is that what you're seeing as your display format? Does it say timecode? Because that should be the default, and that's a good one to use. These other default settings are great as they are. So you can click on the OK button next. Now, I already have one that I'm going to just say yes and overwrite this because I was doing a demo last night. But you guys are not going to see that warning or that question pop up. OK, so here's the empty workspace of Premiere. And the first thing I want to do is go to my Windows menu at the top. And I want to check out what the default workspace is that it has currently. I'm curious, what are you seeing is currently selected as the name of the default workspace? What does it say there? Excuse me? Learning is what you have. Interesting. Let me just click on that to see. Okay. I never used that one. There are tutorials there. Let's not use that one. The one that I would recommend using is editing. It could be editing CS 5.5. Or it could be the editing that does not say CS 5.5. They're pretty similar to each other. I'm going to choose editing that does not have CS 5.5 after it as my main workspace. And then we can see these panels like we saw the other day. The first thing I want to do is I want to import my media just to get things going and get things exciting. So I go to my File menu, and then near the bottom, sort of 75% down, is import ... So I'm going to click on that. And then I'll navigate to where I can find the subfolder. And I can actually just click on the folder itself. If I have all of my stuff already in there, pre-organized, if I just select the folder itself, I can click on import. It'll import the folder and all of the contents inside of the folder. Okay, great. So that whole folder is coming in. And how it shows up here in the lower left is as a folder in this panel. And I can change the border of this panel. If I hover my cursor above at the line at the top of these two bottom panels, I get an up and down arrow. And that means if I were to click, I can change the width or the height, as it were, of this bottom section. And that's super helpful. If I want to change the size of the left panel, I can hover over the bottom edge right here and change that size. And I can do the same thing with my timeline panel. And then we notice that the toolbar, and the toolbar is this thing in the middle right here, that will just change automatically based upon the sizes of the two adjacent panels on either side. And I like to have just myself, I enjoy having my midline pretty much at the middle of my screen, at least to begin with. And then as I work, I might change this to be lower or higher, depending on what I'm doing inside of the program. Okay, so if I double click on that folder, I'm going inside of this panel. And right now I have thumbnail view. If I want to change that to be list view, there's this icon at the bottom left, which is the list view, being able to just sort of see all these images as a list. And the list view is kind of interesting because it shows me the file names. It shows me the frame rates, which is really interesting and useful sometimes. And then there's other things which are not going to be as necessarily useful, but it can be useful to check out these things, especially in terms of media duration. And if you want the media duration actually to be closer, you can actually click on the tab for media duration, sort of just move that over. And this just tells you how many seconds and how many frames is the duration of that shot. And that's what this time code is right here. It really starts with this first number being 00 is hours. So it's 0 hours. Sorry, that's yeah, exactly. So 0 hours. The next set of zeros is minutes. And so this is 0 minutes, but I can see that it's 11 seconds. And then the 17 after that semicolon indicates how many frames. 17 frames after the 11th full minute. Sorry, the 11th full second plus 17 extra frames is what that means. And that just means it's almost 12 seconds, but not quite. It's about halfway towards being 12 full seconds because I have a 30 frame per second clip, as I can see right here. So that's just like 11 and a half seconds. This one is just over 19 seconds, so on and so forth. I myself use the thumbnail view because that's just like much more exciting. And as I hover my cursor over the thumbnail, it allows me to actually see that clip from the beginning to the end. Like it's a way to review the full shot because the initial image is really just the very first frame of that shot. And you may not actually remember what that shot is based upon the first frame. But if you bring your cursor and just sort of go over the image from left to right, it scrubs through the entire shot from beginning to end. And it's a really great way to check out and remember what these shots are from the beginning to the end. Now, if I double click on one of these thumbnails, like this one right here, it loads it into my source monitor at the top left. And this is a way for me to see it bigger as a preview. I can click on the blue playhead here and scrub through the whole shot from beginning to end to get a sense of like what's there. And then I can make a decision about what portion of that shot I want to bring into my timeline, if I want to bring a portion in. Now, I haven't actually started a timeline yet. So let me actually just pause a moment and talk about that. You could just grab a clip and drag it into your timeline, and automatically the timeline would sort of like initiate itself. I'm not going to recommend that you guys do that. It's okay if you do. It's not a big deal if you do, but sometimes that can cause some issues, especially if you have different kinds of clips coming from different cameras. And if that's the case, there can be some less desirable like qualities that will arise from your timeline sequence if you drag, for example, a low resolution clip first into your timeline. Then everything in the timeline is going to be based upon the low qualities of that first clip that you grabbed. And that could happen with certain projects. It's not likely to happen with this project, but that's why I don't clip and drag and drop like that. I will actually go to my file menu. Sorry, I think you guys might have lost my screen because Zoom. There we go. I think you guys can see it again. So I would go to the File menu, New, and then New Sequence. Click on that. And then there are these presets. Now, you can ignore all of these folders except for the one that says AVCHD. AVCHD, I would go to first, and then I would expand the folder for the 1080p. Sorry, not I, but 1080p. And then when you look at that, you're going to see that there are various presets for what your sequence settings can be that would all be 1080 resolution. Now, who here has heard of 1080 HD as a video resolution? I would imagine all of you have. It's a pretty standard common resolution for video. What's the next step above 1080 that you might have heard of? It's even bigger resolution than 1080. Yeah, Brian. Yeah, and then 4K. 4K is a pretty well-known one above 1080. 1080 is pretty good, and it's what I'm going to assume that you guys have with your phones is shooting in a standard 1080 HD format. If you happen to have shot in 4K, I would just recommend that you don't actually output into 4K, because that would actually be very difficult to edit, because it would just be very demanding for the processor of your computer. So even if you happen to shoot in 4K, which I don't think happened for this project, I would recommend still using a sequence of a 1080, just because the processing time will be a lot easier with your laptop. And depending on the frame rate, you might change, you might make different choices for what the frame rate will be. I would ignore the one that begins anamorphic, even if you happen to shoot in 24 or 25. Don't do the anamorphic. You could just do the one that is the regular 24 frames per second or 25 frames per second. As a default, if you don't want to make the choice and have to think about it, just choose the 30. So AVCHD 1080p 30, which stands for 30 frames per second. You can choose that. However, if you shot at 60 frames per second, which I believe that Red did for a lot of his shots, then Red, you would choose the one that ends with 60 for that preset. Okay, I'm going to choose 30 though for my demo, because I shot at 30 frames per second, and that's what I would recommend that you guys all do, unless you know you shot at 60 frames per second and you want to use that higher frame rate in your project. So I'll click on OK. Okay, now I have an actual sequence in my timeline. It's actually empty, but I have the sequence going right here. And I'm going to choose something from earlier. Let me just scrub through. Yeah, I might start with this. The first clip that you bring into your timeline does not need to be the beginning of your movie. You could actually edit in a non-linear way. You can move things around. It's really, really flexible. So you could just sort of start with a shot that you're actually most excited about. And that would honestly be a great way to go, unless you have a really clear, creative idea for how you want to begin your movie. Just go to the shot that you actually are most excited about and happy with. Bring that in your timeline first, and then build from there. It might build in either direction into your timeline, but honestly, that's a really great way to go. Just like start with a shot that you're most excited about in terms of its creativity. And for me, I was pretty happy with the reveal of the fence and whatnot. So I'm going to just click and drag this into my timeline like so. And then it has this question for me. The sequence settings does not exactly match my clip settings. And because I made a conscious choice for what my sequence settings will be, I'm going to say keep existing settings, because I made that choice and I know it was a good choice. I'm going to stick with it. So I want to keep the settings that I already had selected for my sequence. I'm going to click on that keep button there. And I would recommend that you do that yourselves. Now, this is a really tiny clip in my timeline. There's a couple of ways that I can make the clip bigger as a view in my timeline. One would be looking at the scroll slider at the bottom of my timeline panel. And if I hover over the right button or the left button of that scroll bar, if I click and drag it to make it a smaller scroll bar, that is one way of zooming in on my timeline to make my clip or clips bigger in that panel. And that just gives me a more detailed view of the clip. And notice that I have it in here now in the upper right panel, the program panel, that is showing me what's in the timeline. And that's what the upper right panel does. So the upper left panel shows you previews of the images in your media bin, which are those thumbnails in the lower left panel. The upper right screen, your program panel, shows you what's in the timeline. Okay, so now that I have this in here, in my case, I don't want to have the audio track. I dragged it in there because it was really intuitive just to like click on this image and drag it into my timeline. I have a video track, I have an audio track, but I don't want the audio track in my case because I want to have just like background music and make this feel more like a music video with creative cinematography with that background music going on. So if I do that, I can push Control and click on this clip to get this pop-up menu. Very similar to Photoshop, right? We get this pop-up menu and also all kinds of other software. On a PC, of course, that would be a right click if you have a Windows device to get the pop-up menu. And then one of the items here, sort of like in the middle top area, it says unlink. If I click on that, that means I can select the video clip or the audio clip separately from each other. And then if I click on the audio clip, I can just push delete to remove the audio clip from my timeline. But here's the thing, I can actually just delete that clip, so it's not in my timeline anymore. And I'm going to talk about another way that you can import things from the upper left screen into your timeline. If you want the video only, notice that there's a little icon below the preview image that is like a little celluloid icon. If you hover over that, it says drag video only. If you hover over this, this icon next to it, that is a little picture of waveform, which of course is like a digital representation of audio content in an audio file. And if you click and drag that, that would be dragging the audio only into your timeline. Here, I want just video. So I'm gonna just click and drag that video, and then I'll stay, again, keep existing settings. And now I have just a video here, which is what I have in mind for myself for this project. You can make this choice yourselves. If you envision that the audio that was captured in your video clips will play a meaningful role in the video that you produce, that is totally fine. For myself, I'm going to have mine, be like no audio from what was shot in the camera, and it's going to be just the background music like we have in the teacher demo that I shared with you guys here. Now, if you want to make a track bigger or smaller in the timeline panel, if you hover over, like say, the top edge of video track 1, V1 stands for video track 1, you can actually make that a bigger track or a smaller track in the timeline. So I'm going to have this like be a little bit bigger right here. Then I'm going to expand video 2 a little bit for later maybe. And then similarly with audio, but I'm not going to do the audio until later, until I actually have an audio clip that's put in here. So let me go to the end of the shot here and look at how it ends. I kind of clunk and thunk into this metal gate. And that was my idea for one video transition. So I'm going to find this other shot where I begin with this telephone pole. I think it was this one. I double click there, check this out. And yeah, so this is the next shot that I had in mind. It starts with this idea of pulling out from this middle bar. And then I can just click and drag the video only into my timeline. And it sticks. It's going to like want to stick. That's because the magnet is on. It's called the snapping tool. And that's really useful. Having these clips stick to each other, because it really just sort of saves you time in terms of how they can be pieced without any gaps or spaces between them. If you want to deactivate the magnet tool for some reason, because you want to position something without that sticking or that snapping, look in the upper left of the timeline panel, you see a little magnet icon right there. If you click on that so it's no longer blue, then when you move something, it's not going to be sticking. Usually I do have it sticking with the magnet on, but sometimes it's nice to actually switch the magnet off so it doesn't stick. So here, let's just play this back. Look at the upper right to see how that transition works. Now it's okay, but notice that there seemed to be like a little bit of a pause. It's a little bit of a longer thing. I want to trim out a little bit of the beginning of the second clip because it sort of just takes too long to get started. So I'm going to go to my first selection tool, which is the default. It's called your selection tool, the very top tool here in your toolbar. And if I hover over this clip, I can click and drag to determine a different starting point for the clip. Basically, I'm trimming the beginning of my second clip when I do so. And let's imagine that that feels like it's a good starting point just before it begins to pull out. And then notice that there's a gap right here. I can just click on this and sort of move it back and sort of get it to get stuck again to the first clip. And we can play that back to see how it looks. And that's pretty good. But I'm noticing also there seems to be like a weird kind of pause. Not weird, but there's a bit of a pause at the end of the first clip. And so I'm going to be trimming out a little bit of that. I'm going to zoom in a lot more for this. I'm going to turn off my, my magnet tool so I can have a little bit more precision with this. And notice a little detail here. In what direction is my red arrow facing right now for my cursor? To the left, obvious. What does that actually mean? It means that if I were to click and drag, it's going to be impacting the clip, which is to the left of my cursor. If I were to have it moving slightly over to the right, and now that the arrow is pointing to the right, that means if I were to clip and drag, it's going to be altering the clip to the right of the cursor. So it's important to know like which way that arrow is pointing so that you know which clip is going to be affected by the change. And if I click and drag this over a little bit, I'm going to notice that in the upper right panel, I can see like there's a preview that just sort of shows me as I'm clicking and dragging, I'm not releasing the mouse, and it's just showing me like where it is if I were to release it. And I want it to end pretty quickly after I sort of like thunk into the gate or into the banister railing there. And just after it begins to get a little bit gray, because I think that might blend better with my metal pole, and then release. And then I'm gonna make another choice here for the upper part. Like maybe I want a little bit of the gray of that metal pole shot to be visible as a match. If I'm gonna like try to like sort of like match these, if I'm gonna be a bit of a nerd about sort of like, you know, these details, which I am, I'm a bit of a detail-oriented person, then I wanna have like a nice match right there. So then when I bring them together, hopefully it feels more seamless. Get my magnet back on so it snaps. And let's just see how that looks and compare the difference. Pretty good, right? It was pretty fluid now. It doesn't have a pause like it had a moment ago. It's pretty fluid and it sort of moves along quickly. So those changes, while they might have like felt really small and minuscule, they really do help with the rhythm and the flow of the playback. Now, I'm gonna undo a couple of things and show you another way that I could be doing that. Not using the selection tool, but using a different tool. So if I go to the third tool right here and hover over, it says Ripple Edit. I'm gonna click on that. And if you actually click and hold, like with Photoshop, there are other tools next to it, but let's just focus on the Ripple Edit tool itself. And now as I hover over, notice that instead of being a red arrow, it's a yellow arrow, which indicates it's the Ripple Edit which is being used. And let's pay careful attention. Look really closely to see what happens here, and let me know if you can tell what the difference is between the Ripple Edit and the selection tool. So I'm going to click and drag like I did a moment ago. I'm going to pull it out like this and just bring it back to the point where it just barely gets a little bit gray, and then release, and look really closely at my timeline when I release. Did you notice the difference between that and what I had done a couple of seconds ago with the red cursor selection tool? Let me try it with this other. If there's not a quick idea about that, I'm going to just change this other clip. I'm going to be trimming this clip, making it a little bit shorter just to get to the point where I have a little bit of gray, which is about right here. And again, notice I'm making this clip shorter. I'm trimming the beginning of the second clip. And what's the difference? Yeah, Brian. Yes, exactly. Another way of saying it is there's no longer a gap between the two clips. The clips stay stuck together. And so Brian said it perfectly. When you're using the Ripple Edit tool, it will keep clips which are adjacent to each other, which are stuck to each other, it'll keep them stuck to each other. So you actually don't have a gap. You actually have to like sort of like, you know, squeeze and move to sort of like, you know, replace the gap by moving things over. So the Ripple Edit tool can save you time because it just keeps adjacent clips all stuck together. And that can be very helpful, especially if you have like say 20 clips in your timeline. And if you want to do like a little bit of a trim between two clips, if you use the Ripple Edit tool, all of the clips on one side or the other side of that trim that you're doing, they're going to just stay together. You're not going to have like a gap you need to remove. It's not a big deal to remove the gap, but it just like saves you some time not having to remove the gap if you're using the Ripple Edit tool. Now, if you forget that, that's okay, because if you do something and you're like using the regular selection tool, if you have this gap, another way to remove that gap is hover over the gap, control click or right click over it, and then there's this really nice option called Ripple Delete. If I Ripple Delete, that means it removes the gap, and everything on either side of that gap will just move in to fill the void. Ripple Delete. And so that's something that you could do if you forget to use the Ripple tool itself, and you want to remove a gap between two clips. Okay, so lovely. Let's just sort of see how this plays back. And great, that's a really smooth, nice transition there. Now, what if I want to add something to the beginning of this clip where I have another sky shot, which I think maybe is this, oh, not that one. This is where I ended a shot. It's this one, I think. Oh, no, it's a different one entirely from later on. That's right. I think it was this one. I did a couple of sky transitions. Not that one. Maybe it was this one. Yeah, and then this is the one that I ended on a sky. So here's where I imagine that I want to actually bring this clip in so it's before both of these two clips. What I could do is I could just like, zoom out of my timeline by making my scroll bar bigger, select both of them. And the way that I can select both clips is click outside of these clips and then drag on top of them. And that's sort of like a lasso is being cast on top of the clips. And I can just sort of move them both together out of the way to make some space for this clip, drag and drop it into my timeline. And then I could just bring these quickly together here. And I'm going to get my magnet back on so they snap, because that's super helpful often. Then I'm going to grab all three of them. And I can sort of just keep them out here. If I want to have like, room in the beginning and after, I can just sort of have them out in the middle of the space and then, move them over when I'm ready to export later on. Let's just check out this transition right here. And that's pretty good. But, if you actually are going to be like looking really carefully, which is not something that you need to worry about yourselves, this transition actually worked great. I would say that there's no need for a cross dissolve, but there was a little bit of like a little bit of like a flicker, right? Like it wasn't like maybe as clean as it could be. And so just want to reset this. That went a little bit off. Reset workspace. Okay, give me a second here. Go back to where I was a moment ago with this. Okay. So playing this back again, there's just a little bit of a blip. Like there's this thing that sort of poked in. I don't really want to have that in there. But then also I want to show you a cross dissolve as part of this demo. And this is going to be a moment for me to explain for it to make sense. So I want to just say this really slowly, what this is all about right here. So first of all, let me do this with another clip entirely. I'm going to come back to that one later. Command-S, I'm going to just save this because Command-S is just a great thing to do to just go as you are editing along. Do a Command-S just to update your file, so you're not going to be losing any of your edits in case your computer freezes, in case the program shuts down. Command-S. So I'm going to be showing like one more thing before we take a break, because I think that we could use a break in a second. So it's going to be coming up in just a moment here. But I want to look at one of these clips, which was this flower shot that leads to this mailbox shot, which I had done. So here's the shot. Yeah, it begins with this lily, right? Sago lily. What kind of lily is that? I'm so bad at flowers. Anybody know? Any young botanists here? I'm so bad at flowers. Well, it's a kind of a lily, I think, of some kind. Feel free to let me know later if you secretly know and want to enlighten me. So this ends on that mailbox shot. That's great. So let's just drag the video only into my timeline. And this one begins with a mailbox, so I can actually just stick this so that they're joined together. I'm going to undo that, though, because it seemed like I actually dragged on top. And this is something to notice. If I actually click and drag this on top of this clip right here, notice just what happened to that second clip. I've covered it over. And the term for that in editing is that I've overwritten it. If I overwrote it, that means I've actually removed a big chunk of what was in the beginning of that clip. In that case, I didn't want to do so. I want it to just sort of just be stuck to it, but not overwrite the beginning of it. But if that happens on accident, I could, remind myself what the ripple edit does and just click and drag this out. And then I get the beginning of that second clip back. Let me do that again so you guys can actually look at that carefully to sort of see what the behavior is of these other clips right here. Now, again, it's the second clip that I overwrote on accident. I have this yellow arrow pointing towards the right, which shows me I'm going to be impacting the second clip. And then when I click and drag this towards the left, what I'm doing is I'm extending the beginning of that clip to get back that information, to get back the beginning of that clip. So I clicked and dragged it to the left to get the beginning of that second clip back. And then when I release, I noticed that all of those clips to the right, they moved over because it was a ripple edit that I had done. And they just sort of like, they accommodate. They're sort of just moving and doing a little sideways dance to accommodate that change with the ripple edit. So now I have these back. Let's look at how that looks as a cut between the two. Whoa, that really doesn't work very well, right? Because I had started the other shot like a little bit early, which was on purpose, but I can't include the entire ending, like the entire ending of this shot, because that just is not like where the cut should happen. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit right here to check out, the second shot right here, right? I have more than I really need. So I'm going to figure out like where I want to place that cut. And it's going to be like, say, about, I don't know, maybe about here. And then I will do my ripple edit for the second clip and then click and drag this to my playhead and then release. And then that's pretty good now. Let's just check this out. Pretty good, pretty nice, pretty seamless. And I'm going to create a little bit of a video transition inside of my editing tool. Now, this is going to be different than the transitions you guys were practicing with when you were shooting. So I want to pause a moment to talk about the difference between the two. Now, when you're doing an in-camera video transition, like you guys were practicing for your shooting for this project, that involves you to like envision what two different shots might look like when you edit them together in your timeline. You're pre-visualizing and you're shooting. Yeah, Ravu, what are you up to there? Oh yeah, okay, just want to check. You are envisioning how these two shots can come together and you're shooting accordingly with a certain creative idea in mind. But then there are transitions inside of the editing software, which are different. And those are things like, cross dissolves or things that you might be familiar with from like say iMovie, where you just have these effects, which are digital effects, that are editing effects that you can apply to your timeline. And those are called video transitions in the software. And so to see where our transitions are in the software, it's going to be in the lower left panel. If you click on this double arrow right here, which is the top right corner of the lower left panel, it shows you other tabs which are available inside of that panel. And one of those is called effects. So if I click on effects, then I'm going to look at the one that says video transitions, expand that, and then I'm going to expand the one that says dissolve. A great transition to start with is called cross dissolve. And it's a transition that I use almost all the time myself because it is just really, really useful and does a really good job. And as I click and drag this on top of the cut between those two clips, I'm noticing that I'm not able to actually have the transition bridge the two clips. And I want to spend a moment talking about this before we take our break, because this is initially confusing, but it's a really important thing to understand in editing. Now, let's just play this back to see how it looks. As you guys are looking at my preview monitor in the top left, can you identify an issue that's happening here? Yeah, Red, how would you describe this issue? Yeah, it's kind of like going back. It's showing me more of the end of the, no, sorry, this is the second shot. So it's showing me more of the beginning of my second clip than I wanted. And that's how all video transition effects will work, is that you have like what you've defined as the cut between the two clips, but what the video transition needs to do is actually needs to expand beyond those cuts a little bit to basically create a little bit of an overlap between the two clips. And the overlap is what allows the cross dissolve to actually happen. Now, in this case, it's a distraction. And then here's a big lesson about video transitions for how they can actually work a lot better, is that you need to actually trim your video clip a little bit more in order for there to be a little bit more of a margin between the two clips for that blend to actually work. And so I'm going to actually be trimming both of these down a little bit. And then I'll click on cross dissolve to select it and just delete it to delete that transition. And then let's see if I can get this to actually span the two. Now I can get the transition to actually span both edges of those two clips that are next to each other. I couldn't do that before. It was forcing it to be only on one side because I didn't have any margin to work with. Now, what do I mean by that? First of all, let's actually look at how this turned out. And that's pretty good. I'm going to zoom in a little bit more and show you guys that you can actually modify the clip itself. If you hover over, like if you zoom in a lot on top of, sorry, you can modify the transition itself. If you zoom in to see a big view of the transition, if you hover over one edge with the selection tool going, if you click and drag this inward towards the middle, it shortens the duration of that transition effect. And if you hover over on one edge or the other and drag it outwards, it'll lengthen the duration of that transition effect. And I maybe wanted it to be a little bit longer. And then I'm thinking that actually I might have a little bit more room. I mean, honestly, that works pretty well. If I play this back, that looks great to my eye. But let's just say for creative purposes that I want to have it a little bit more included for both of the clips, where I want to actually include a little bit more of the first clip and a little bit more of the second clip. So I'm going to click out and then go to my ripple edit tool. And just a little bit, I'm going to extend the end of the first clip a little bit, just a touch like, say, that. And then I'm getting a little warning there, which is interesting, which I'll talk about in a second. I'm going to extend the other clip just a little bit, like, say, that. And here, this little warning thing is interesting. What it's basically telling me is that I've included a little bit more than I really should have for the transition to work really well. And so I could make this a little bit of a shorter transition in order to accommodate that and just sort of see how that looks now as it plays back. Oh, love it. Magic, gold, Command-S. So another thing that I want to show is how we can actually make a certain selection from the source monitor. So we're not actually just grabbing the entire movie shot into our timeline, because oftentimes we don't want to do that. We want just a selection to be moved into our timeline. So how do we do that? Well, I have this clip loaded here in my source monitor. My volume down a little bit. And I can just sort of just scrub through here really quickly and just going to see, actually, because I had this idea of intercutting between this pedestrian bridge and a second pedestrian bridge that I was on, and I want to sort of like intercut between the two, like you guys saw in the teacher's demo, I want to have just like a certain section from this one shot included. And so I can move my clip to the point where I envision starting the shot, which is not the very beginning. Yeah, around there. So I'm going to here, and then I can create what's called an in point. An in point is the beginning of a selection. In point is what it's called. The shortcut for that is the I key, I for in. Now, if you forget that, the long way of doing that is going to your markers menu at the top, and I'm going to just clear in and out so that that goes away here in my panel. Oh yeah, notice that the panels, there's a little blue boundary around a panel to show you if a given panel is selected or active or not. So right now, my timeline panel and the lower right is blue around the border. That means the timeline is currently selected. If I want to select the upper left panel, I click on it, and now I have a blue border around that. So now that it's selected, I can do the long way of doing it. Mark in is the long way. So under the markers menu, mark in, or the I key, like I said, is the shortcut. So I've marked it in, and then I'll just go ahead to where I want the selection to end, which is when I have my hand passed down the first time as a visualized video transition. So about there. And then O for out is the keyboard shortcut. So I is the in point, O is the out point for the selection. Now that I've done that, I can click and drag on my video icon, video only, bring it into my timeline here. And it's just it's funny, my player, there we go, finally came up. It's just that selection which now appears in my timeline. Pull a hand away, opening of a sequence, blah, blah, blah. There's some mystery. What are we looking at? There's the intrigue. This is a reveal shot where the more you look at the shot, the more is revealed over the course of the shot. And then, boom, hand comes down. Now I look for my other pedestrian bridge, where I did a sequence. So that first hand is going to be my endpoint, and it's going to be like, somewhere like where the hand is in the middle. And there's a shortcut for your keyboard. If you want to play on your keyboard, you can push the spacebar. Spacebar is play. Another way to play is the L key, and this is the one that I want to emphasize because this is super useful when you're doing your editing. L plays. And the reason people have the L key is because K stops. K is your middle finger. If you have your middle finger over the K, then your ring finger is going to be the L button, and then J plays backwards. And that's super useful as you're sort of like navigating and trying to like define exactly where you want the playhead to be. L forward plays forward, K pauses, J plays backwards. If you push L twice, if you push J twice, it plays backwards. K again pauses. If you do L 3 times, that would be quadruple speed. Yeah, quadruple speed 3 times, right? with speed, and then J 3 times is backwards. So J, K, and L are super useful, and they're designed to be all next to each other with these three fingers, with your hand. So you're not going to get, any strain on your wrist. It's minimal activity because they're all next to each other. I'm going to go back to where that was, and then back until like right here. Now, if I have my arrow key, if I arrow left or arrow right, that would be moving the playhead one frame at a time. So I can sort of just like really precisely go with my arrow, one frame at a time to like say there, and then I for in. And interestingly, if I have my three fingers on the JKL, I is right above my middle finger. I sort of just move my middle finger a little bit to do the I. And then O is right above the ring finger. So I, O, JK, and L, they're all like right next to each other. And it's really handy to actually just get the practice of actually having your three fingers there, because there's a lot of quick marking and navigation and playing back and playing forward with just those three fingers. Okay, then I'll just use there. Back it up to there, and then O for out, and then video only. Grab this in like so. Then let's just see how that looks. Ooh, there we go. Love it. Great. Okay, so titles we can talk about. I'm going to be doing titles in the video tutorial that I put on Schoology this afternoon. How to get your title in there. I'm going to be putting a couple of other things in that tutorial. But the last thing I want to talk about before we go into Creative Lab time would be music. Now, I have already downloaded some music onto my computer, and I'm going to be talking about how we can be converting from YouTube and talking about other issues or concerns regarding use of music in a moment. But let's actually just do the demo for getting it in here. Command-I to import, and I've already pre-organized this in a music folder. I'm not going to get the whole bin in there because I know that I only want, like, say, one song in here. I think it was this one. Was it that one? I think it was this one. It was that one. Okay, Blown a Wish, track 9, import. Great. If I double click on this, I can get it into my source monitor. And so if I wanted to, I can make a selection. You don't have to start your background music at the beginning of the actual audio file. You could begin like in the middle. If there's like a certain segment that you want to emphasize, you can begin anywhere that you want to. I for in, you go to the end of where you want that to be in an O for out. In this case, though, I'm going to just have it start from the beginning. So I'm going to clear my in and out. And just from the very beginning, click and drag this audio icon into A1, which is audio track 1 at the very beginning here. Now, if I want to be able to see all the contents of my keyboard, the / key, which is the key above the return key, it will just sort of snap so that anything which is in your timeline it'll be zoomed at a point where you can see all the contents in your timeline. So the / key, which is the key above the return key, will show you the full timeline view of the contents in your timeline. And later on, I'm going to need to trim my audio clip because it's not going to be, actually, in this case, it was actually the full 3 minutes for my teacher demo. But let's imagine that yours is going to be shorter. In which case, if we imagine that yours is going to be like, maybe it's like a 2-minute video, and maybe I'm really happy with like there. You might actually position it so it ends like on the beat. It's always good to be editing to the music. That's not perfect, but let's imagine it is perfect. But we want to fade it out. It's tempting to actually sort of forget this or to ignore like the really wonderful things about fading in and fading out when you're doing editing. But if you have like an abrupt end or an abrupt beginning to something, especially with music or audio, that can be a little bit jarring. It can be a little bit distracting for the audience. Easing in, easing out. Now, if I start at the very beginning of this music track, it already fades in because that's how the song was recorded. But if I'm ending in the middle of the music, I don't want this abrupt ending. So in order to fade it out, I click on this double arrow here in the lower left panel to get back to my effects tab. And then one of the effects folders here is audio transitions. Expand that, expand crossfade. And these three are actually pretty similar to each other. I just, as a standard, use what's called constant power. Click and drag this and drop it at the end of my audio clip, and then we can hear it fade out. Nice fade out there. Much better as an ending. And like with other transitions, if I were to zoom in on my timeline, you can actually make it a longer fade out by hovering over one end of the transition and increase the length of it. And this is going to be a longer, slower fade out. was pretty good. A slower fade out to me felt a lot better than the nice, lovely fade out. And then exporting, like I said, I'm going to have that in a tutorial that I'm going to do it really quickly now before I talk about other things regarding music. So I have another version of this in Premiere that's available to me, which is the completed edit that I used for the demo that I shared with you all. So I'm going to open up that version, and we're going to check out the timeline to see these different transitions that I put in for the video effects transitions, how the music looks, and how that all looks in the timeline. There are no titles in my teacher's demo, but I'll add that for what I'm bringing to school to do this afternoon. So here's my completed project. I have this thing called an adjustment layer. I think that we don't really have time to get into that, and it may not really be. I'm going to think about that. I might talk about that in the tutorial that I add this afternoon, but it might not really be, what we're going to focus on for this. So let's imagine that this is my video. I'm really happy with it. It has everything mastered and it's perfected, and I'm ready to export. So to export, I go to the File menu, and then down to this export, and I get the side menu, and I click on Media. And in order to do this successfully, I do need to make sure that the right panel is selected. So the right panel would be the timeline panel. I need to make sure that I have a blue boundary around the timeline panel. Then I'm ready to export. So export the media that's in the timeline that is currently selected. And then again, this is going to be in the tutorial, so just don't worry about this stuff. But as far as the format goes, click on the H.264 format. The preset, you could scroll down for the preset to be Vimeo 1080p or YouTube 1080p. Or if you have 60 frames per second, if that's the case, you could actually just stick with match source high bitrate. And that just means that when it's exporting it, it's going to be matching the settings of your timeline at a high bitrate or a high quality write speed. If you're not shooting at if you're not doing a film that's at the 60 frames per second, then it's nice to actually make these decisions consciously for the 1080p down here. Actually, no, I misspoke there. It's actually not the frame rate per se for the 60 frames per second. It would be 4K, but you guys aren't doing 4K. So yeah, even if you are doing 60 frames per second, it's okay to choose the Vimeo 1080p preset or the YouTube 1080p. Either one of those would be okay, as long as your resolution is the 1080, which I think everybody I believe is for this. So I'll just choose the Vimeo 1080p. And then this one is not obvious, but this will be, again, in the tutorial as your reminder, output name. Do click on that, because this is how you can choose the destination folder and then give the final file name to the video file that's going to be exported from your project. So I'll go into my class folder here, and then semester 2, project 3. And I might have that in a different folder. I mean, I myself, because there's so much footage, raw footage, in your first subfolder, I might create another subfolder inside of your class folder that's called exported videos. Because then it's only going to be 1 or 2 or maybe 3 if we happen to do 3 this term, but 1 or 2 probably in that folder, and it'll be really easy to find later. So creating this new subfolder, exported subfolder, exported videos folder, and then my name. I can just rename this later, but it's going to be proj 3a _ reveal. I know that the project doesn't say that right now, but I'm going to change that. So reveal is going to be the more meaningful keyword, and then click on save. It doesn't save anything yet. That is simply the file name in the destination folder. To export it, you need to actually click on the export button. So all of these other defaults, you can ignore all of these other settings as you like. Click on export, and then it's going to just do the work of exporting the project. Depending on the speed of your computer, that might take a minute. It might take 4 minutes. It might take 7 minutes. But I doubt it would take longer than say 10 minutes. But again, it really just depends on the computer that you have and the processing speed that's available to it. I'm going to cancel this, and I'm going to stop recording. Actually, before I stop recording, are there any clarification questions? If there's an individual one-on-one kind of question, we can just jump into that in a moment. But are there some questions that might be helpful for the entire class to hear before we go into class lab time? All right, I think we're ready for class lab time. I'm going to stop the recording, and I'm available pretty much in just a moment to float around and touch base with you one-on-one to help you guys develop your editing.
Mr. Quinn,